I texted the family group chat, flight lands. At 3 p.m., can someone please pick me up after I buried my husband overseas and my brother's cold? Reply made my blood run ice cold. I typed one message into our family group chat the second the plane hit cruising altitude. Flight lands at 3. Can someone pick me up? I just buried my husband. Military honors, overseas soil. A flag folded into a tight triangle, pressed into my hands like it could replace him. The cabin lights dimmed. I stared at the screen and watched the delivered tag turn to read. I waited. Noah and I had been married 6 years, 4 of them spent apart, stitched together by video calls and time zones that never lined up. Deployments don't wait for anniversaries. They don't wait for anything. So I hadn't asked my family for much over those 6 years. This time I asked for one thing, a ride home. My brother Jason answered first. Busy. Try Uber. 2 minutes later, my mother. Why didn't you plan better? I read both messages twice, then a third time, waiting for something else to load underneath them. Nothing did. No, how was the funeral? No, we're sorry. Just cold. Just fast. Just clean. Like wiping a countertop. I sat with my phone in my lap for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock at the top of the screen count them. Somewhere over the Atlantic, at 38,000 feet, I felt something crack open in my chest. It wasn't grief. I'd already met grief. In a chapel outside Nettuno with cypress trees standing guard and a flag going into a box instead of a closet. This was different. This was recognition. You think family is the thing that catches you when you fall? Sometimes they're the ones who let go first. I typed back 2 words. No worries. Then I turned my phone face down on the tray table and let the silence do the rest of the talking. We landed at 3:04 in the afternoon. I didn't cry in the jet bridge. I pulled my coat tight over the black dress I'd worn to a funeral 11 time zones away, walked past a family hugging a soldier who'd made it back whole, and kept walking. There was a black SUV waiting at the curb. Government plates. 3 men in dress blues standing beside it like they'd been carved there. One of them stepped forward before I'd even reached the sidewalk, took the carry-on straight out of my hand without asking, and said only, "Ma'am, we've got you from here." His voice cracked a little on the word ma'am. I noticed that. I noticed everything that afternoon, the way grief sharpens the smallest details while blurring the large ones, so that I couldn't have told you what the weather was doing, but I could tell you the exact shade of navy in his tie. Because here's what my family didn't know when they told me to try Uber. I wasn't landing alone. Noah Bennett and I got married on June 14th, 2019, in the backyard of my aunt's house in Wilmington, North Carolina, under a tent that leaked when it rained, which it did, for exactly 6 minutes during the vows. I was 23. He was 25, 3 years into the Marine Corps, already stationed at Camp Lejeune, already the kind of man who ironed his own uniforms even on leave. We had 6 years together. 4 of those years, he was somewhere I couldn't follow. Djibouti, 29 Palms, a training rotation in Norway I only ever saw through photographs he wasn't supposed to send. I got used to a version of marriage that ran on care packages and 8-hour time differences. I got used to being the one who stayed. I grew up 40 minutes from where we married, in a split-level house on Greenridge Lane with my mother, Linda, and my older brother, Jason. My father left when I was 9. After that, it was the 3 of us. And somewhere in those years, a shape formed that never really changed. Jason struggled. Jason needed things. Jason got them. I learned early that the fastest way to keep peace in that house was to need less than my brother did, so I did. I got good grades because nobody had to manage me for it. I got a job at 16, folding towels at a linen supply company because I wanted my own money and didn't want to ask. By the time I met Noah at 21, working the front desk at a physical therapy clinic in Jacksonville where he'd come in for a shoulder injury, I was already someone who didn't expect much from the people who were supposed to give it to me freely. I remember thinking, the first week we dated, that it felt strange to have someone ask what I needed and actually wait for the answer. Jason is 34 now. He runs a landscaping company out of a rented lot off Highway 17. Or he did, depending on the year you ask. It's failed twice and been resurrected once, mostly on the strength of loans nobody expected back. My mother calls it finding his footing. I called it something else, quietly, to Noah, more than once. The incident that should have told me everything happened at Thanksgiving in 2022. Jason showed up to my mother's house that year already behind on a payment for a used excavator, $4,000 short with a deadline in 9 days. He didn't ask me directly. He asked Noah in the garage over 2 beers while I was inside slicing pie. Noah told me about it that night in the car, half laughing, the way you laugh when something isn't funny yet but might be later. He said yes anyway. $4,000, wired the following Monday. No paperwork, no interest, just a handshake and Jason's word that he'd pay it back by spring. That same year, Noah and I were still paying off the balance on a used Corolla I'd bought at 19, $210 a month, a payment we never missed and never once asked anyone to help with, even during the lean stretch right after Noah made corporal and our combined income barely cleared $40,000. I mention the number only because it sat in my head for years afterward, next to the $4,000 Noah wired Jason without blinking. 2 very different pictures of what my family considered reasonable to ask for and reasonable to give. Spring came, then another spring. Noah never brought it up again, not once. And when I asked him why, he said something I've thought about more times than I can count since. He said, "Some things you don't lend for interest. You lend them so you can say you tried." I didn't understand what he meant then. I understood it better later, once I saw the full shape of what he'd been trying at. My mother knew about the loan. She never mentioned repayment either. What she mentioned happened, that Christmas and the one after, was how hard Jason was working, how much pressure he was under, how I'd always had it easier because I landed on my feet with a husband who had steady pay and good benefits. She said it like a compliment. It never felt like one. I remember standing at her kitchen sink that second Christmas, drying a casserole dish, and asking her, carefully, whether she ever worried about me the way she worried about Jason. She laughed, not unkindly, and said, "You've never given me a reason to worry, sweetheart. That's the difference." I didn't say anything back. I just kept drying the dish until it squeaked. My father leaving when I was 9 left a specific kind of vacancy in that house, the kind that gets filled by whoever shouts loudest into it, and Jason, 3 years older, learned to shout early. I remember him at 12, throwing a controller across the living room because he'd lost a video game, and my mother kneeling in front of him asking what was wrong instead of asking him to pick it up. I remember being 7, watching that, and quietly deciding I would never be the reason anyone had to kneel down like that. It felt at the time like a kind of maturity. It took me 20 years to understand it was actually a kind of disappearing act, one I'd gotten so good at performing that eventually nobody in that house thought to look for me at all. Noah met my family for the first time over a 4th of July cookout the summer we got engaged, and he told me on the drive home, half laughing, half not, that he'd watched my mother refill Jason's drink 3 times without being asked, and never once offer to refill mine. I told him he was reading too much into a cookout. He didn't argue. He just said, "I'm not, but I understand why you'd want me to be," and reached over and took my hand off the gear shift. And that was the end of it, that night. It wasn't the end of it, not really. It was just the first time someone had said the quiet part out loud in front of me, gently enough that I could still pretend not to have heard it. Noah noticed things I'd stopped noticing, because I'd grown up inside them. He noticed that my mother asked about Jason's truck before she asked about my flights home. He noticed that at every family dinner, there was a chair reserved, conversationally, for whatever Jason was going through, and none reserved for anything I might be going through, quietly. 4 years into a marriage held together by satellite calls. Once, on his second-to-last leave before this deployment, he sat across from me at our kitchen table in Jacksonville and said, "Your family runs on debt, Claire, not the money kind. The kind where you owe them for existing, and Jason's the only one who ever gets a receipt." I told him he was being dramatic. I believed that mostly because it was easier than believing the alternative. Noah's own parents had divorced when he was 14, messily, over money that never seemed to exist until there was a reason to fight about it. And he told me once that watching that fight had taught him the opposite lesson it seemed to teach everyone else in his family. Instead of learning to grab what he could before someone else did, he'd learned to notice who was quietly going without, because in his house growing up outside Macon, Georgia, that had always been his little sister, and nobody had noticed until it was nearly too late to fix. He didn't have a sister anymore by the time I met him, not one he spoke to, and I never pushed him on the details beyond what he offered. But I think that's why he saw me so clearly, so early, faster than I saw myself. He recognized the shape of a person who'd learned to go quiet inside a house that only had room for one child's noise. We didn't fight about my family. We just built our life a little further away from them, the way you build a house a little further from a road that's too loud. Noah's real family, by the time he shipped out this last time, was 3 guys from his unit who'd been through 2 deployments with him and a wife who'd learned to stop waiting for her blood relatives to show up on time. One of those 3 guys was Staff Sergeant Dale Pruitt, who'd been Noah's roommate in the barracks a decade earlier and his best man at our wedding, standing up in a rented tux with a grin so wide my aunt still talks about it. Dale used to say Noah kept everyone's secrets and told nobody his own. I didn't know yet how true that would turn out to be. Noah shipped out for this rotation in February, a training deployment attached to a joint exercise, the kind of deployment that was supposed to be safer than the ones before it. It wasn't. 9 weeks in, a support vehicle rolled during a night exercise outside the wire. Noah was 31 years old. I got the knock on the door on a Tuesday, in the same robe I'd been wearing to make coffee 20 minutes earlier, and my life folded into 2 halves so cleanly I could tell you the exact minute of the cut. The Marine Corps handled almost everything after that with a competence that nearly undid me, because it was the opposite of what I'd get from my own family in the days that followed. Escort officers, casualty assistance calls, a gentle, relentless machinery of people whose entire job was making sure I never had to figure out logistics alone. Noah had written into his estate paperwork years earlier, back when we were newlyweds, and death still felt like a hypothetical you fill out on a form and forget, that if anything happened to him overseas, he wanted to be laid to rest near the men from an earlier generation of his family who'd never come home from Italy in 1944. He had a great uncle buried at the Sicily Rome American Cemetery in Nettuno. He used to joke that it ran in the family, showing up somewhere and staying. I didn't think, filling out that paperwork with him at 24, that I'd ever actually have to use it. So I buried him there, outside Nettuno, under cypress trees, with an honor guard and a bugler, and a folded flag that a young lieutenant pressed into my hands and told me, gently, held 68 years of service in one branch alone if you counted every fold. I flew home alone. That was the plan from the start, because my mother said the trip was too expensive on short notice, and Jason said he couldn't get away from work. I told them both that was fine. I meant it, mostly, the way you mean things when you've already lowered your expectations so far, there's no room left to fall. What I didn't expect was that 6-hour flight, that message in the group chat, and the 2 replies that told me, more clearly than anything in 6 years of quiet slights, exactly where I stood. The Marines who met me at the curb were Dale and 2 men from Noah's platoon I recognized from photographs, still in dress blues from the memorial detail earlier that day. It was Dale who'd spoken first, the one who'd taken my bag and cracked on the word ma'am. He held the SUV door open, waited until I was settled, and only then let his composure slip just for a second, just long enough for me to see it. Nobody else said much on the ride, nobody needed to, and for the first time in 4 days, I let my shoulders drop below my ears. He drove me to my house in Jacksonville that night. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call Jason. I let 3 days pass in a fog of casserole dishes from neighbors and paperwork from the Marine Corps and Dale checking in every morning with a text that just said, "Still standing?" I always answered yes, even on the days it wasn't quite true. On the 4th day, I decided to try again. I am by nature someone who gives second chances before I finished needing the first one. I called my mother and asked if she and Jason would come to a small memorial gathering I was planning at the house, just close family, the following Saturday. She said, of course, we'll be there," in a voice pitched a half note too high, the voice she used when she wanted a conversation to end quickly. 3 days before the gathering, Jason texted to say he couldn't make it. Work had gotten busy, a client had moved up a job, he was sorry. I told him it was fine. I asked if he could still come, even for an hour, since it was the only chance some of Noah's family flying up from Georgia would have to meet him. He wrote back, "Don't make this bigger than it is." I said I can't. When I pointed out gently that I hadn't raised my voice or my expectations, only asked once, he told me I was twisting a simple scheduling conflict into something it wasn't. That's a particular kind of exhaustion. Being told the thing you watched happen didn't happen the way you watched it. My mother came to the gathering alone for 40 minutes and spent 30 of them on the phone in my backyard talking to Jason about a permit issue with the excavator. I know because I walked past the sliding door twice and heard my own name mentioned only in the context of "just for a little while longer, then I'll be back to help you with that." I didn't say anything that day. I made a plate for the Marines who came, thanked everyone for driving in, and put my mother's absence in the same drawer where I'd already been filing things for years. I told myself grief makes people strange. I told myself she'd come around. I have always been generous with the word eventually. 2 weeks after the funeral, the paperwork started arriving, the kind that follows a service member's death like a second, quieter casualty notification. Survivor benefits. A service member's group life insurance payout of $500,000. The maximum coverage, which Noah had increased 3 years earlier without telling me, the way he did most acts of care, sideways and unannounced. I mentioned the SGLI once in passing to my mother, only because she'd asked how I was managing financially and I didn't want her to worry. I regretted it within the hour. By that evening, Jason had called, not to ask how I was doing, but to ask in a roundabout way that took him almost 10 minutes to get to the point of whether I'd thought about helping the family out a little, since Noah, in his words, would have wanted to take care of everyone, not just himself. I sat with the phone against my ear and said nothing for a long moment. Then I told him the money was for me to figure out, slowly, when I was ready, and that I wasn't ready to talk about it yet. He told me I was being cold. He used that word. Cold, the same word I noticed that could just as easily have described a curb at 3 in the afternoon with nobody on it. I thought about the 2 texts still sitting at the top of our group chat. Busy. Try Uber. Why didn't you plan better? I didn't say anything about the irony. I just said goodnight and hung up. My mother called the next morning to smooth things over, except smoothing things over, in her language, meant explaining why Jason wasn't wrong. He's under a lot of stress, she said. The business, the kids, Megan's hours got cut at the hospital. You have to understand where he's coming from. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, whether anyone had considered where I was coming from. She sighed, the particular sigh she'd been using on me since I was 9 years old, and said, "Why does everything have to be a competition with you? I have my blood pressure to think about. I can't keep having these conversations." She hung up before I could answer. I sat in my kitchen holding a phone that had gone quiet twice in 24 hours, both times because I'd asked, gently, to be seen. 10 days after that, my mother called at 11 at night, her voice tight and breathless, telling me she was in the emergency room at New Hanover Regional with chest pains, that the stress of everything going on with the family had finally caught up to her body. I drove out at midnight, sat with her for 3 hours in a curtained bay while a resident ran an EKG and a chest x-ray, and held her hand while she told me, in a small voice, that she didn't want to leave this world with things unsettled between her children. The tests came back clean. Anxiety, the doctor said gently, nothing cardiac, and recommended she follow up with her regular physician about stress management. My mother thanked me for coming, told me it meant everything, and then, in the parking garage at 2 in the morning, asked if I'd thought any more about helping Jason with the business, since seeing me by her hospital bed had made her realize how important it was for all of us to pull together right now. I drove home in silence, turning the whole night over, and understood I'd just watched a genuine scare get repurposed, in real time, into one more argument for why I owed somebody something. A week after that call, Jason tried a different angle. He showed up at my house on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced, with Caleb in the back seat of his truck, and told me he'd been thinking, and that maybe it would be good for the family, all of us, if I put some of Noah's money into helping him relaunch the landscaping business under a new name. A clean slate, he called it. He'd brought a printed one-page business plan, like a prop, like something to hand a bank instead of his sister. I told him I wasn't in a place to make decisions like that yet, that it had only been a few weeks, that I needed time. He said, "There's never going to be a good time with you, is there?" and got back in his truck without saying goodbye to me, though he waved at me through the windshield the way you'd wave at a neighbor, pleasant and empty. I stood in my driveway a long time after he left, turning that sentence over. "There's never going to be a good time with you," as if the problem had always been my timing and never his asking. In that same stretch, I started hearing from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Small, strange messages that only made sense once I understood where they'd come from. My cousin Brianna texted to ask, out of nowhere, if I was doing okay mentally. A question with a shape I didn't recognize until she mentioned, almost apologetically, that Jason had called her the week before to say he was worried about me, that I'd been acting erratic since the funeral, that he just wanted someone else in the family to keep an eye on things. I hadn't spoken to Jason once that week. I asked Brianna what exactly I had supposedly done that was erratic. She didn't have an answer. Jason hadn't given her one either. He'd just planted the word and let it grow on its own, the way he'd always been good at doing, quietly recruiting an audience before he ever needed one. I called him about it directly, the one time I let myself get close to raising my voice. He told me I was being paranoid, that he'd only expressed normal concern for his sister, and that it said something about me that I'd twist a brother's worry into an accusation. I hung up before I said something I couldn't file away in the same drawer as everything else. Around this same stretch of weeks, Dale started showing up more than he needed to. He'd drive down from Lejeune on his days off, fix things around the house that didn't need fixing, sit at my kitchen table and talk about Noah in a way that didn't require me to perform strength for him. One evening, fixing a cabinet hinge that had been loose since before Noah deployed, Dale mentioned, almost as an aside, that Noah had left a folder with him before this rotation. "Not the will, not the official stuff, you've already got all that," he said. "Just a folder." He called it his just-in-case folder, told me to hang on to it, said I'd know when. I asked what was in it. Dale shrugged and said he'd never looked. That wasn't the deal. And the conversation moved on to something else before I thought to press. I didn't think about it again for almost 3 weeks. I had other things breaking my attention into pieces by then. The breaking point, the one that finally showed me the whole shape of what I was dealing with, came from something small and stupid, the way these things usually do. My mother posted an old photograph to Facebook, Jason and me, at maybe 8 and 11, dressed for a 4th of July parade, grinning under a banner that read Whitfield Family Reunion 2003. Her caption read, "Family above all, always. So proud of my children." Nothing about Noah, nothing about the funeral 3 weeks earlier, or the flight, or the fact that her daughter had come home a widow to 2 cold texts and an empty curb. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. Someone else did it for me. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, who wrote underneath the photo, "Didn't you two not even pick her up from the airport after she buried her husband?" That comment got 9 likes in an hour, then 30. Then it got shared onto a local moms group, then a veteran's spouse page, and by the next morning it had found its way, the way these things do now, onto the community Facebook group for half of Onslow County. Jason texted me that afternoon. One line, "Didn't realize it was that serious. You should have said something." I read it twice, sitting on my back porch with Dale's dog, who I was watching for the weekend, asleep against my feet, as if grief required an invitation, as if burying my husband under cypress trees in a country neither of us had ever visited before was something I should have scheduled around his excavator payment. I typed a reply, deleted it, typed another, deleted that one too. What finally went out was 4 words, no punctuation. "You made your choice." I didn't send anything after it. I didn't need to. A mirror only has to be held up once. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize with a local area code. A producer from WECT, the NBC affiliate out of Wilmington, said she'd seen the Facebook thread, had also seen a shorter clip that a stranger at the airport had apparently filmed of me getting into the SUV with the honor guard, and asked carefully, respectfully, if I'd be willing to talk about it on air. "Not a hit piece," she said. "Just my story, in my own words, if I wanted to tell it." I told her I needed a day to think. What I actually needed was a day to sit with the fact that my own family's silence had gotten loud enough, on its own, to reach a newsroom before I'd said a single public word about it. I said yes the next morning. Not for sympathy. I've never wanted sympathy. It always felt like something handed to you instead of something you'd earned. I said yes because some people only recognize what they've done once the whole town is watching them do it. The segment ran that night, right after weather, right before sports, 90 seconds that felt like they lasted an hour. Footage of me stepping out of the SUV, still in black, the flag pressed to my chest, 3 Marines standing behind me like walls nobody could knock down. The anchor read a line from a note I'd handwritten and given the reporter, the one I hadn't planned to have read on television but somehow didn't take back. "If you ever find yourself alone at the edge of grief, stop looking for the people who left you there. Look for the ones who show up anyway. They didn't use my name. They didn't need to. Wilmington is smaller than it thinks it is. I know my mother's wine glass hit her kitchen tile within the hour, because Megan, Jason's wife, texted me privately less than 20 minutes after the segment aired. 'Was that you on Channel 5? I didn't answer her. Not out of spite. I just didn't have anything left in me that night to explain. The group chat stayed dead for a full day after that. Not one apology. I've learned learned that silence tells on people faster than words ever could. And that day, it told on my family loudly enough that I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The same producer called again 2 days later. The 90-second segment had done numbers she hadn't expected, she said, and she wanted to know if I'd sit down for something longer. Not a clip this time. The whole story, in my own words, however long it took to tell it right. I thought about it for a full afternoon, sitting on my back porch with Dale's dog again, and decided the same thing I decided the first time. Some people only understand what they've done once the whole town is watching them do it, and my family, evidently, needed a bigger audience than a 90-second clip could give them. The studio was smaller than I expected. One camera, one boom mic, a single anchor named Renata Cole, who'd covered enough hard stories in this town to know how to ask a question and then actually wait for the answer instead of filling the silence herself. She asked me what happened when I landed. I looked into the lens instead of at her because I'd decided beforehand that this wasn't really for her, and said the sentence I'd been carrying in my chest for a week. I buried my husband with honor, and I came home to silence. The room went still in a way rooms do when everyone in them recognizes they're watching something true. I told her about the 2 texts. I told her about the SUV at the curb, and the 3 men in dress blues who'd driven 6 hours round trip on their own time because a friend asked them to. I didn't say Jason's name. I didn't say my mother's. I didn't need to. Half the county had already filled those blanks in for me on Facebook. But I said one line near the end, unplanned, that I knew before it finished leaving my mouth would end up outliving everything else I said that day. Blood doesn't make you family, I told her. Showing up does. Renata didn't say anything for a second after that. She just nodded once and moved to her next question. The interview aired that Thursday night. 6 minutes, no music, no montage, just the 2 of us, and a story that didn't need decoration. By morning, my phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Strangers, veterans, a woman in Jacksonville whose husband had died in a training accident 2 years earlier, telling me she'd cried through the whole segment because somebody had finally said the thing she'd never found the words for. My mother left the group chat that same week without a message, without a word. Jason renamed it from family to just group, as if changing 4 letters could undo what 6 words in a screenshot had already done. 2 days later, a letter showed up in my mailbox. Plain envelope, no return address, handwriting I didn't recognize, careful and slanted. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone writing slowly on purpose. I almost tossed it in with the flyers and the coupon mailers. I don't know what made me stop. I opened it right there at the curb, keys still in one hand, mail still tucked under my arm, and read 3 lines that made my hands go cold before my mind caught up to why. I know what really happened at that airport. I know what your brother said before you ever texted that group chat, and I know why your mother really wasn't there. I looked up and down the street, empty driveways, parked cars, nobody watching from a window that I could see. I read the letter again, then a 3rd time, then a 4th. Whoever had sent it wasn't finished making their point. There was a name, written small, almost an afterthought, at the very bottom of the page. I had to tilt the envelope toward the porch light to read it clearly. It wasn't Jason's name. It wasn't my mother's. It was Noah's. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I didn't call Dale that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in front of me, the overhead light too bright, and I read it so many times the paper started to soften at the fold. The next morning, I drove to Lejeune without calling ahead. Dale opened the door in a t-shirt and running shorts, took one look at my face, and stepped back to let me in without a word. He read my face before I said anything, the way people who've done multiple deployments together learn to read faces quickly for information you haven't decided yet whether to share. Come in, he said, and stepped back before I'd even opened my mouth. I held the letter out to him. Did you send this? He read it standing in his kitchen, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, somewhere between guilt and relief, like a man finally allowed to put down something heavy. Not exactly, he said. I mailed something. Not that. He walked to a hallway closet, reached to the back of the top shelf, and came back with a manila folder, worn soft at the corners. Noah's handwriting across the front in block letters. Just in case. He gave me this before we shipped out, Dale said. Told me if anything ever happened to him I was supposed to wait. Said I'd know when it was time. He set it on the counter between us like it might still go off. I watched the news Tuesday night. I figured that was when. Inside the folder was a sealed envelope with my name on it in Noah's handwriting, and a second, shorter note, unsealed, addressed to Dale. The note to Dale said only, if her family shows you who they are, make sure she isn't the last to find out. Send her the letter. Tell her I'm sorry it took this to prove me right. I opened the sealed envelope at Dale's kitchen table, and Dale, to his credit, walked outside and let me read it alone. Noah's handwriting filled 2 pages, front and back, dated the week before he shipped out. He wrote that he'd watched my family for 6 years, quietly, the way he watched everything, and that he'd never said the worst of what he saw because he didn't think it was his place to hand me a version of my own life I hadn't asked for. He wrote about the $4,000, and about my mother's blood pressure size, and about a phone call he'd overheard the last time we were all together at Christmas. My mother telling Jason on the porch that I'd always managed fine on my own, so there was no reason for either of them to worry about me the way they worried about him. He wrote that he hadn't told me because he was scared it would sound like he was trying to turn me against the only family I had. And some things, he said, a person has to see for themselves or they never really believe believe them. He wrote that he'd almost said all of this to me in person, more than once, and had talked himself out of it every time, because some truths feel like accusations when they come from the mouth of someone who loves you, and he never wanted me to hear it that way. He wrote that if he didn't come home, and if my family failed me the way he suspected they eventually would, he wanted me to have proof that at least one person had seen it clearly, the whole time, and had loved me anyway, not despite my family but in spite of them. He wrote that Dale would know when to send it because Dale had sat across from him the night he wrote it, and told him he hoped to God he was wrong. He was not wrong. When I finally went back outside, Dale was sitting on his back steps with his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. I sat down next to him and didn't say anything for a while. Eventually, he told me he'd almost opened it himself, more than once, in the months since Noah handed it to him, and that he was glad now he hadn't. It wasn't mine to read, he said. It was mine to carry. He told me carrying it had been harder than he expected, that every time he'd driven down to fix something at my house that didn't need fixing, some part of him had known what was sitting in his hallway closet, and had hated not being able to tell me. He made me promise, Dale said. I don't break promises to dead men, especially not that one. I told him I understood. I told him I was grateful, even if gratitude felt like a strange, small word for what he'd actually done, which was keep a piece of my husband alive and waiting for exactly the day I would need it most. Near the bottom of the second page, in smaller handwriting, like he'd run out of room for everything he still wanted to say, Noah had written one more thing. Whatever happens after this, don't let them talk you into believing quiet was the same as easy. You were never the easy one. You were just the one who never made anyone pay for it. The letter didn't tell me anything about the exact words Jason said before I sent that group text, or the precise reason my mother wasn't at the airport that day. Those were mine to find out on my own, and I did, in the weeks that followed, in pieces. Megan, Jason's wife, finally told me the truth over coffee 3 weeks later, her hands shaking around the cup. Jason had been on the phone with my mother 20 minutes before my flight even landed, telling her he wasn't driving out to the airport, that I'd chosen a life away from all of us the day I married a Marine, and that if I needed something now, I could learn to ask like everyone else did instead of assuming the family would drop everything. My mother hadn't argued with him. She'd been at his house that whole afternoon, helping him pack up equipment before a landlord showed up to inspect the rented lot, because Jason was 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction from the property his business ran out of. She chose that crisis over my flight the same way she'd chosen every one of his crises over every quiet thing I'd never asked her to notice. Noah hadn't known those specific facts. He hadn't needed to. He'd known the pattern well enough to write a letter, 8 months before he died, that predicted the shape of the exact day I was living through, with an accuracy that still makes my chest hurt to think about. I sat in Dale's kitchen for a long time after that, the letter in my lap, and understood that the man I'd buried under cypress trees in Italy had left me something my own blood family never had, proof that I'd been seen. 3 weeks after Megan told me the truth over coffee, my Aunt Carol hosted a celebration of life for Noah at the same house where we'd gotten married, the same yard, a different season. Relatives who couldn't make the trip to Italy came from 3 states, carrying casserole dishes and photographs, and the kind of soft, careful conversation people use around a widow they're not sure how to talk to yet. My mother came, Jason came, with Megan trailing a half step behind him, her eyes not quite meeting mine. I hadn't planned to say anything. I'd told myself, driving over that morning with the folder still zipped into a laptop bag, I'd told myself I wasn't going to open, that I would eat, thank people for coming, and let the day be about Noah instead of about what was broken in my family. I'd made that promise to myself twice more in the car, like a person trying to talk themselves out of a decision they've already made. That plan lasted until Jason, 3 beers in, standing near the dessert table with 2 cousins and an uncle, said loudly enough for half the yard to hear, "It's a shame the news made this whole thing into a circus. Some people really do love the attention." The yard didn't go silent, not all at once, but it thinned out, the way a room does right before something happens. I walked over with the folder in my hand. I hadn't planned to bring it out here. I'd been carrying it in my car for 2 weeks, unsure what I'd ever do with it. "What did you say?" I asked him, and I kept my voice level, because I'd learned by then that Jason mistook volume for weakness and calm for an opening. "I said people love attention," he repeated, like I hadn't heard him the first time on purpose. "You could have just called us instead of going to the news." "I called you first," I said. "You told me to try Uber." "That's not what happened," Jason said, and there it was, the same reflex I'd watched my whole life, the instant rewrite. "I never said that." I opened my phone, pulled up the group chat, and turned the screen so he and everyone near the dessert table could see it. Busy. Try Uber, time-stamped, still sitting there exactly as he'd typed it 3 months earlier. Undeleted because he'd never imagined he'd need to. Nobody said anything. My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "I'm not doing this here," Jason said. Quieter now, the volume finally catching up to what I'd been saying all along. "You did it there," I said, "at the airport. On the phone with Mom 20 minutes before my flight landed, telling her I'd chosen a life away from all of you and I could learn to ask for things like everybody else." I watched his face change, watched him try to find the rewrite for that one and come up empty, because Megan was standing right there, and Megan already knew, because Megan was the one who'd told me. And Mom wasn't at the airport because she was at your house helping you pack up equipment before your landlord showed up, 3 months behind on rent. "I know that too." My mother's voice came out thin. "How could you possibly? Because your own children told on you, I said. You just didn't know it yet. I set the folder down on the dessert table, next to a plate of my aunt's lemon bars, and I told them, in front of everyone who'd come to remember Noah, about the letter he'd written 8 months before he died. I told them he'd seen this exact day coming, had written it down, had trusted a friend to make sure I wasn't left to find out alone what my family really was. I didn't read the whole letter out loud. Some of it was only for me, but I read one line, the one I'd underlined the second night I couldn't sleep. He knew I'd have to see it myself before I'd ever believe it, so I made sure someone would be there to catch you when you finally did. Nobody clapped, nobody cheered. This isn't that kind of story. What happened instead was quieter and, in its own way, worse for them than any argument could have been. My uncle, my father's brother, who'd flown in from Ohio, set down his plate and said, into the silence, "Linda, is that true? About the rent?" My mother didn't answer him. She didn't have to. Her silence, the same silence she'd handed me at 3 o'clock in an airport 3 months earlier, finally landed on someone other than me, and I watched her understand, in real time, what it felt like to be on the wrong end of it. "I need everyone to know I never wanted this," my mother finally said, to the yard, not to me. "I never wanted it to look this way. It doesn't look anyway," I told her. "It is this way. It's just the first time anybody but me has had to look at it directly." My grandmother, my mother's own mother, had been sitting near the porch the whole time, 91 years old, quiet as a rule, the kind of quiet I used to think meant she didn't have opinions about any of it. She proved me wrong that afternoon. She set down her tea, looked at my mother, and said, in a voice that carried further than I expected from someone her age, "I raised you better than this, Linda." I know I did. My mother didn't answer her either. Some silences, I was learning, cost more the second time they're spoken, and my mother had now spent hers twice in one afternoon, once on me and once on her own mother, and had nothing left to spend it on anyone else. Jason left before dessert was served. Megan stayed another 20 minutes, sat with me on the porch steps, and told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she'd been thinking about leaving him for a while now, and that watching this happen had made the decision feel less like a betrayal of her own family and more like the only honest thing left to do. I didn't tell her what to do. I just told her I understood, better than most people could, what it costs to keep choosing peace with someone who's never once chosen it back. The weeks after Aunt Carol's gathering unfolded the way I imagine a house does after a storm finally passes, and everyone comes out to survey what's left standing. My uncle from Ohio called me twice that first week, just to check in, something he'd never done in the entire 30 years I'd known him. My cousin Renee, the one who'd left the comment on my mother's Facebook post, started texting me regularly. Small things, articles about military widow benefits, a link to a support group for spouses who'd lost someone overseas. I hadn't expected allies to come from the edges of my family instead of the center of it, but that's often where they were hiding the whole time, quiet, waiting to see who else would say something first. Megan filed for divorce from Jason 6 weeks after the celebration of life. She told me later it wasn't only about that day, that there'd been years of smaller cracks I never saw, but that day had been the moment she stopped being able to pretend the cracks weren't structural. She and Caleb moved into a rental 2 streets over from my new place the following spring, close enough that Caleb rides his bike to my driveway some Saturdays, and Megan and I have dinner together most weeks now. An easy, unhurried kind of friendship neither of us expected to build out of the wreckage of my brother's marriage. She tells me sometimes that watching me hold my ground that day at Aunt Carol's gave her permission to imagine holding her own. I tell her I'm glad something good came out of a folder full of proof I never wanted to need. Jason didn't take it well. He called me twice in the same week, the first time angry, accusing me of destroying his marriage by airing family business in front of people who had no right to it. I asked him whether he thought Megan had stayed married to him this long because of anything I'd said at a potluck, or because of years of things he'd said and done long before I ever set a folder down next to my aunt's lemon bars. He didn't have an answer for that. I told him I hadn't put a single word in his mouth that he hadn't already said himself. He hung up on me. The second call, 4 days later, was different, softer. He told me his son, my nephew Caleb, who was 7, had been asking why Daddy and Mommy weren't living together anymore, and that things were tight without Megan's second income, and he wondered if, given everything, I'd consider helping the family out, just until things stabilized. He used Caleb's name 3 times in that call. He mentioned Caleb's asthma, unprompted, a detail he'd never once brought up before he needed something from me. I sat with the phone against my ear and recognized the shape of it immediately. The same shape as the excavator loan, the same shape as everything, dressed up now in a 7-year-old's name because that was the leverage he had left. I told him no. I told him I was sorry about Caleb, that I loved my nephew and would always show up for him directly, but that I wasn't going to be a line item in a budget for a business that had already cost this family more than money. I told him I'd set aside a small fund at the bank, separate from anything he could touch, for Caleb's activities and school needs, that I'd manage directly, on my terms, not his. He called me heartless first, then, 3 sentences later, called me generous, in the same breath, like he couldn't decide which version of me served him better in the moment. I'd been called worse by people who knew me less. In January, Jason had a lawyer send me a letter, some low-cost attorney working out of a strip mall near his rented lot, suggesting that as Noah's surviving in-law family, we might have grounds to discuss an equitable division of estate proceeds, citing, vaguely, contributions Jason claimed to have made to Noah and my life over the years. letters. Patricia read it once, laughed under her breath, and wrote back a single page explaining, in careful legal language, that no such grounds existed under North Carolina law, that the SGLI payout named a sole beneficiary, and that any further correspondence of this nature would be treated as harassment. I never heard from that attorney again. I did hear from Jason, 3 days later, a text that said only, "Wasn't my idea. Forget I sent it," as if a letter drafted by his own lawyer had arrived on his stationery by accident. My mother tried a different approach. She showed up at my house unannounced on a Tuesday evening in October, stood on my porch in a coat I recognized from a decade of Christmases, and asked if we could talk without an audience this time, just the two of us. I let her in. I owed her that much, if only because I'd spent my whole life owing her things I never agreed to. She cried at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once slid a slice of pie across to Noah while he told me, laughing, about the $4,000. She told me she'd made mistakes, that Jason had always needed more from her, and she didn't know how to stop giving it, that somewhere along the way she'd started measuring how much I needed by how little I ever asked for, and mistaken my silence for strength instead of what it actually was, which was practice. That was the closest she came to actually understanding it. I believed she meant it, in the moment, the way you can believe someone means something without believing it will change anything. I told her that. She cried harder. I didn't take it back. There were logistical things, too, underneath all of it. The unglamorous machinery of a life restructured by death. The survivor benefits paperwork took 4 months to fully settle. I hired an estate attorney in Wilmington, a woman named Patricia Ossie, who'd handled military benefits cases for over a decade, mostly because Jason's phone calls had made me paranoid enough to want everything documented, airtight, beyond argument. Patricia helped me set up a trust for a portion of the SGLI payout, something Noah and I had actually discussed once, vaguely, years earlier, about wanting to eventually fund scholarships for military kids whose parents didn't come home. I hadn't planned to start that so soon. Grief moves you toward things you thought you had years to get to. That first Christmas came just weeks after the celebration of life, and for the first time in 29 years, I didn't have a house to drive to on the 25th. Renee called me on the 23rd and told me, without asking, that I was coming to her place in Raleigh, that she'd already told her husband to set an extra chair, and that this wasn't a discussion. I cried in my car in her driveway before I went in, not from sadness exactly, more from the strange vertigo of being wanted somewhere without having had to earn it first. Dale drove up from Lejeune that same afternoon with a case of Noah's favorite beer he'd been saving, and the four of us ate too much and played a card game badly and didn't once mention my mother or my brother, and it was, without question, the best Christmas I'd had in a decade. I sold the house in Jacksonville in December, 4 months after the funeral, not because I couldn't afford to keep it, but because every room in it held a version of Noah I wasn't ready to keep walking past. I moved 40 minutes north to a smaller house outside Wilmington, close enough to Aunt Carol that she started leaving casseroles on my porch the way she once had for my mother. There was a night in late November I still think about more than most of the others. I drove out to the small memorial marker the Marine Corps had helped me place at the Veterans section of Oakdale Cemetery, a stone with Noah's name and dates, empty underneath because his body stayed in Natuno, per his own wish, near his great-uncle. I sat on the cold ground in front of it for almost an hour, not crying, just sitting, the way you sit with someone after there's nothing left to say. I told him about the letter. I told him Dale had done exactly what he asked. I told him I was angry that he'd known, for months, exactly what my family was, and hadn't told me while he was still alive to help me carry it. I told him I understood why he hadn't. I told him I forgave him for it, mostly. And I told him something else, something I hadn't said out loud to anyone yet, not even Dale. I told him that some nights, underneath all the anger at Jason and my mother, there was a quieter grief I hadn't made room for, the grief of a family I would never get to have, not the way other people had them, not broken like mine, not requiring proof and letters and a dead man's foresight just to be believed. I mourned that family the way you mourn a person, because in a real sense, it had died the same year Noah had. I let myself sit in that for a long time before I drove home. The groundskeeper found me there around 8, making his last round before locking the gate, and instead of asking me to leave, he just switched off his flashlight and stood a respectful distance away until I was ready to go on my own. He told me, walking me back to my car, that he'd buried a brother in the Gulf War and that some visits to a stone don't have a time limit, whatever the posted hours say. I didn't know his name. I never got it. But I think about that small kindness from a stranger almost as often as I think about the folder in Dale's closet, because it was one more piece of proof that the people who show up for you rarely announce themselves in advance. Renee tells me Jason still brings up the interview sometimes, at family things I don't attend anymore, framing it as the day his sister humiliated him on television, as though the humiliation had originated with me instead of with a screenshot he'd typed himself. I don't correct the story when it reaches me secondhand. I've learned that some people will always need a version of events where they're the one something was done to, and arguing with that need rarely changes it. It just exhausts the person doing the arguing. I'd rather spend that energy somewhere it might actually grow into something. Jason and I haven't spoken since the phone call about Caleb. My mother and I talk maybe once a month now. Short calls, careful ones, neither of us quite trusting the other not to bring up December again. I don't know if that will ever change. I've stopped needing it to, which is its own kind of ending. Quiet quieter than the one I expected. Patricia tells me, whenever I ask, that the trust is fully funded now, that the paperwork is clean, that nothing about my finances could ever again be pulled into a conversation about family obligation without my say-so. I didn't realize until she said it plainly one afternoon in her office on Front Street how much I'd needed to hear exactly that. Not the money itself, the fact that it was finally, unambiguously mine to decide about. It's been a year now since I buried my husband under cypress trees in a country I'd never visited before that trip, and have been back to twice since, both times with Dale, who flies out with me every June because he says somebody from this side of the ocean should keep showing up, and because I think it's easier for both of us to grieve Noah in a place that never asked either of us to explain ourselves. I still work at the same physical therapy clinic where I met Noah 9 years ago, the same front desk where a 25-year-old corporal once filled out an intake form and asked me, half joking, whether the receptionist came with the shoulder rehab package. I kept that intake form, actually, for years, tucked in a drawer, before I finally framed it and hung it in my new hallway. I've since moved into an administrative role, mostly because I found I liked helping other spouses navigate the paperwork nobody warns you about. I've become something like an informal resource for military families in this county who've lost someone, the kind of person other widows find through a Facebook group or a mutual friend, someone who answers the phone at 10 at night when the paperwork gets confusing or the grief gets loud. I didn't plan for that to become part of my life. It found me the way most true things do, sideways, through a version of showing up nobody teaches you how to do until you've had to learn it the hard way. I set up that scholarship fund Patricia helped me finalize, small right now, just under $60,000, growing a little every year, named for Noah, for kids whose parent didn't come home from somewhere overseas. Dale sits on the small board with me. So does Renee, my cousin, who turned out to be exactly the kind of family I never expected to find hiding in the branches I'd already written off. Last spring, we awarded the first scholarship, $800, to a 19-year-old from Jacksonville whose father hadn't come home from a deployment 3 years earlier. She sent a handwritten thank you note that I still keep on my refrigerator, and reading it, I understood something about Noah's instinct to write things down, to leave proof behind in a world that too often only believes what's already been lost. I think about that airport a lot, more than I probably should. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an empty curb, 2 texts that told me everything before I was ready to hear it. I used to think of that day as the worst one, and for a long time it was. Now I think of it as the day I finally got an honest answer to a question I'd been quietly asking my whole life without realizing it. Who actually shows up? Some evenings I still catch myself reaching for my phone to text Noah something small, a joke, a photo of the dog Dale eventually just let me keep, before I remember, in that same half second every time, that there's no number that reaches him anymore. Grief doesn't move in a straight line away from you. It moves in a loop that gets a little wider each year, and you learn to live inside the loop instead of waiting for it to close. Blood doesn't make you family. I said that on the news 6 months ago now, and I still believe every word of it. Maybe more than I did the day I said it into a camera in a quiet studio with one anchor and one question. Showing up does. It's a simple sentence. It took me 29 years, 1 funeral, and a letter written by a dead man who saw my life more clearly than the people who shared my blood ever did, to actually understand what it costs to live by it. Sometimes people who find my videos or read this story ask me if I regret going to the news, if I think I made things worse by making them public. I don't. I think about it the way Noah must have thought about writing that letter, knowing full well it might land on a day already so heavy it could barely hold one more thing. Some truths only get believed once they've been said loudly enough, in front of enough witnesses, that nobody left in the room can pretend they didn't hear it. I didn't make anything worse. I just made it visible. And visibility, it turns out, is its own kind of consequence, one my family had never had to face before because I'd spent 29 years making sure they never would. There's a version of this story where I get everything back, where my mother finally chooses me the way she always chose Jason, where my brother apologizes and means it, where the family I grew up in becomes, somehow, the family Noah tried to warn me it might never be. That's not the story I got. I don't think it's the story most people in my position get, whatever the ending on television made it look like. What I got instead was smaller and, in its own way, more honest. A friend who kept a promise made to a man who isn't here to see it kept. A cousin who spoke up once and kept speaking up. A community of widows who understood a specific kind of loneliness without needing it explained. A folder in a hallway closet with 2 words written on the front that turned out to be the truest thing anyone in my life ever wrote down. I still miss the family I thought I had. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one too often skip past the grief that sits underneath the justice. As if getting the truth is the same thing as getting what you actually wanted. It isn't. I wanted a mother who'd drive to the airport without being asked twice. I wanted a brother who'd show up for my worst day the way I'd shown up, without complaint, for years of his. I didn't get either of those things, and some nights that loss sits right next to the one I already knew I was carrying, and it's heavier than I expected grief to be, doubled like that, quiet and permanent. But I got picked up, not by the people who were supposed to, by the people who actually did. 3 men in dress blues on an empty curb, a folder in a hallway closet, a cousin who wouldn't stay quiet, a friend who flies to Italy every June because somebody should. That turned out to be enough to build a life on. Not the life I planned for at 23, standing under a leaking tent in my aunt's backyard, a different one, mine.